In a recent interview, MCU head honcho Kevin Feige revealed two pieces of interesting information. That he'll be stepping down from his role at the head of the company after the release of 2027's Avengers Secret War, and that movie will lead to a reset of the MCU, which could lead to much-loved characters like Tony Stark returning, but recast. That's quite vague at the moment, but this is what I think they might end up doing with it. Hello, welcome to Culture Filter. I am Phil, and this is the channel where I like to talk about all the geeky pop culture that I like and consume. Things like Doctor Who, things like Star Trek, and things like the MCU. Which is what we're talking about today, and its apparent upcoming reboot. Sorry, Feige. Reset, which is his preferred word for it, apparently. And look, I get it. Reboot is a word that has been often misused over the years, and therefore maybe it's one to just best avoid, because it doesn't just mean a relaunch of something. A relaunch by itself does not a reboot make, although it is used more and more in that way by click-hungry media groups that like to put it in headlines. Hell, maybe I'm even guilty of it, maybe I put it in the title of this video. Sorry. But to be clear, things like 2005's relaunch of Doctor Who with Christopher Eccleston was not a reboot. The upcoming Buffy the Vampire Slayer series, if everything we've heard about it is to be believed, is not a reboot, because the continuity of the previous series carries on. So what's happening with the MCU? Is that going to be a continuation of continuity or a reset? Well, we don't know a whole lot at the moment, but some things based around the fact of it's that movie, Secret Wars, could give us a few clues and let us speculate of what might be coming. And yes, in some ways you might be able to refer to it as a reboot, an in-universe one. We'll get to that. It can't be coincidence that Feige said this will happen after Secret Wars. The comic book story of that name, well, the more recent 2015 comic story called that. There was a 80s one that had the same name, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the 2015 one. That involved the multiverse being all kind of smooshed together into what was known as Battleworld. Battleworld was a world with multiple realms within it, each with their own certain flavour and own collection of characters, but those characters would be assembled from various Earths and worlds of the multiverse. For instance, there was a realm that just had an army of Thors. All Thors, just different type of Thors. Thors from across the multiverse. And this world as a whole was ruled by Doctor Doom. Now at the end of that universe, the prime Marvel universe that we mostly follow in the comics, i.e. the 616 universe, was restored, but not without some changes. There were some things added in from other universes, as if they had always been there. For example, the Spider-Man from the Ultimate Universe, Miles Morales, was incorporated into the mainline 616 universe, again like he had always been there. So don't be surprised if a similar thing happens here. The combining of elements from different bits of the multiverse in order to create a brand new 616, or whatever you want to call it, main MCU Earth, where some things might be the same as we remember from the previous film's depiction of the MCU main timeline, the sacred timeline as they like to call it, and some things might be different. This means that characters and actors who are not quite done with the MCU yet, that there is more story to tell for them, and the actors are still enthusiastic about taking part, and the creatives behind it are still enthusiastic about those actors, can continue with the storyline from when they left off before Secret Wars. But it also means that characters who have died could be re-established as if they hadn't died in the first place, and recast if those actors that played them originally are either A, too old now, or just not interested in doing it anymore, or the creatives want a younger version of that character, or they're just too expensive. Yes, I'm looking at you, Robert Downey Jr. Although probably any of the original Avengers count as that now. Feige already specifically mentioned the possibility of recasting Tony Stark in this interview, but we might get more. Will we get a new Steve Rogers after the potential underperforming of the latest Captain America movie? That's a possibility. Maybe we'll be going back to a Steve Rogers Captain America, but it will be played by someone new. I'm personally not really sure how I feel about that, because I like the idea of legacy characters, another element from the comics which the movies have only just started to really explore. And I kind of want to see that explored a bit more. Legacy characters, of course, are where the mantle of a superhero is passed on to a new generation. When they retire or die or whatever, they pass the title of that character on. So, there have been multiple, in DC there have been multiple Flashes, there have been multiple Robins, there have even been multiple Batmans, although that one usually does eventually circle back around to Bruce Wayne eventually. It's happened less, maybe, with Marvel, but they have started to experiment with it and do stuff with it over the last decade or so, and we've seen that also start to filter into the movies, and I quite like that, and I would hate to lose that completely. Here's something else they might do, the X-Men. We know we're going to get some X-Men, ones we're familiar with, from those old Fox movies. We're going to have Patrick Stewart back, we're going to have Ian McKellen back as Magneto, we'll probably have Hugh Jackman back as Wolverine, I imagine. I think there's a few others that have also already been announced that will be back. We've seen a few return in Deadpool and Wolverine already, so we know we're getting them back in some Avengers movies coming up, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the wholesale integration of the X-Men into the mainline continuity of the MCU, but with new actors. If you've got worlds mushing together and we're going to end up with a new, fresh MCU where things can be different, the history of the MCU doesn't have to be what we've seen it as on screen so far, it seems like the perfect opportunity to integrate mutants into the world of the MCU as if they've been there the whole time. That way you don't have to go through that whole humanity discovering mutants phase of the X-Men story before you assemble the X-Men. Hell, the X-Men could already be in existence, sort of like they were a bit at the beginning of the first X-Men movie at this point. But obviously some of those actors that have been in the Fox movies have been doing it. Hugh Jackman, for instance, they've been doing it for 20 years. They probably had enough now, and we do kind of need some new actors in those roles. So it's an opportunity to recast them in a way that doesn't feel as egregious as recasting someone like Tony Stark or Steve Rogers, because those two are from the universe that we're kind of reshaping here, whereas the X-Men are from a completely different studio and a completely different universe. Yes, they've been in some of these films as cameos, but they're not from this universe. They're not from the MCU. Now, a similar thing could be done to incorporate the Fantastic Four into the MCU a bit more fully. We've got them kind of coming over from their universe in the new movie, I gather. I have not seen the movie yet, but the post-credit scene of the Thunderbolts seems to imply that. So we've got one way of bringing them to our universe, but if they wanted to, they could use Secret Wars to mush that more fully in so that they were the first superhero team in the MCU, much like they were in the comics, Marvel's first family. Still played by the same actors, still played by Pedro Pascal and all, but now with a slightly different history than they have in their movie that's coming up. So if these universes all have converged to create this new status quo, that can also be used to draw a line under the multiverse saga for good, or at least for now. Now, don't get me wrong, I've kind of enjoyed most of the stories that revolve around the multiverse within the MCU. I really like Spider-Man No Way Home, I really like Loki, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. They were all good films and I've enjoyed them, but the phases, the multiverse saga as a whole, with all the films that it and TV series that it encompasses, has had a bit of a more mixed reception than previous phases. And to be honest, even though I've enjoyed those multiverse plots, it does feel like it might be running out of steam now, and maybe it's time to do that one last big thing with it and move on. So perhaps with these merging of worlds, there isn't a multiverse anymore, or if there is, the MCU is somehow cut off from it, so that we don't have reasons why people need to be hopping between universes for at least another decade of films. Maybe they can rediscover it later on, but for now, let's have them cut off from the rest of the multiverse, or have a story where it's all converged into just one universe. Well, that's how they can present it to us now. The great thing about science fiction and fantasy and comic book stuff is you can always retcon this later. You can always say, if somebody wants to have a multiverse story in 15 years time in the movies, you can always say, oh yeah, we thought we were the only universe, but turns out we were wrong. What these two things do, cutting off from the multiverse and also establishing that the history of the MCU as we've seen it has been changed and moulded, and there's bits from different universes can have been plugged in, what it does is it sort of gives us a clean slate for future creative visions. Because with Feige exiting, this kind of feels like the perfect way to give his successor, whoever that may be, the freedom to do and shape a new MCU as they want it to. They can pick the bits that they want to carry forward from the old MCU, and they can discard the bits that they don't want. The bits that serve their own creative vision. So is this a reboot? Kind of. It's an in-universe reboot. Comics have been doing this for literally decades. I think kind of like really the first one was really DC Comics Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they had loads of other Crisis events which kind of reset continuity or merged continuities or changed continuities in some way. And it was always a way to kind of clear out the backlog of continuity and be able to tell stories without having to worry that you were contradicting stuff in the past. 2015 Secret Wars comics was another version of that, a way of bringing characters from a now defunct spin-off line, the Ultimate Comics, which set in another universe, bringing the most popular characters from there into the main universe so that they could stop those comics. You also had Brand New Day, where, because of the events of Civil War in the comics, Spider-Man's identity had been revealed to the world and he wanted that changed, so Brand New Day kind of did a reset on a much smaller scale for sort of Spider-Man's world in the comics. And outside of comics, things like Star Trek have done this with the Kelvin timeline movies, where in the first one in 2009, you had an in-universe explanation for why this new timeline where different things happened to Kirk and Spock and McCoy than we saw without having to worry about the continuity from decades of TV series and movies before had happened. Prime Spock travelled back in time, changed the past, and now we've got a whole new, turned out trilogy of movies set in a completely different timeline, but it happened in universe. And I actually kind of think that's the best way of going about this, because it does the best of both worlds. You can reset the timeline in a really, as Star Trek proved, an accessible way that doesn't throw people off, but it also kind of takes care of the people that do care about continuity to a degree, because you're like, okay, no, that continuity happened, and then somebody did something in the universe, in the story, to change the past. And it's part of the story, and I think that makes it much more palatable. What do you think? If they do this, which bit of continuity from the MCU do you think they should keep? Which things do you think they should discard? Who do you think should be recast, and who do you think should be kept as legacy characters or as they are? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. And why not check out this other video from me where I solve the conundrum of the fact that they've called the MCU Earth 616 when that's the designation for the comics universe. There's an explanation. I think I found it. Check out the video.